What if becoming a professional knitter meant years of training, traveling across Europe, and passing a demanding test? While men worked toward becoming master knitters inside powerful guilds, women and girls learned outside them. How did both worlds shape knitting, and what ended the guilds? In the previous video, we discovered how knitting developed across medieval Europe. But as knitted garments became more desirable, the craft began moving in a surprising direction. What happened when knitting became valuable enough that people wanted to control who could make it, sell it, and profit from it? For some knitters, learning the craft meant entering a structured world filled with rules, training, examinations, and standards. Just how young boys entered this world, what they experienced along the way, and how long it would take before they had the chance to become master knitters will unfold throughout this story. But what about women and girls who were also knitting? Their path looked very different, raising another question. If they weren't following the same formal route, where were they learning their remarkable skills? For centuries, these two worlds existed side by side. Then changes in fashion, production, technology, and society began challenging the system that had controlled professional knitting for generations. To understand how knitting became important enough to require years of training, we need to return to the European cities where skilled trades were increasingly being organized and protected. Because by the late Middle Ages, knowing how to knit was one thing. Being permitted to make a living from it could be something entirely different. One of the earliest references associated with an organized commercial knitting trade appears in Paris in 1268. These early organizations weren't necessarily the powerful institutions we would see centuries later, but something important was happening. Knitting was moving beyond household production and becoming increasingly valuable as a commercial skill. By the 1400s and 1500s, knitting guilds and organized professional knitters appeared in different parts of Europe, and changing fashion helped create a profitable market for their work. Woven cloth could be cut and sewn into clothing, but knitted fabric could stretch and conform to the body. That became particularly valuable as men's European fashions began emphasizing the legs. Close-fitting stockings made from wool, and especially from fine silk, could become highly desirable garments among wealthy customers. The better fit, the finer yarn, and the more accomplished the workmanship, the more impressive the finished garment could be. Professional knitters also produce caps, gloves, jackets, and other knitted goods. Governments sometimes became involved in protecting textile trades as well. One interesting example comes from England. The Cappers Act of 1571 required much of the population over the age of 6 to wear an English-made wool cap on Sundays and holy days, although there were some exceptions. Imagine that what legislation like that could do for a trade. Instead of waiting for customers to decide they wanted a cap, the law itself created demand for enormous numbers of them. Guilds offered professional knitters another kind of protection. They could establish standards, regulate training, inspect workmanship, and limit who could legally compete within their jurisdiction. For customers purchasing expensive garments, they could provide confidence in what they were buying. For guild members, it could protect their livelihoods, but there was another side. If the guild controlled entry into the profession, knowing how to knit wasn't enough. You had to get inside. For a young boy hoping to become a master knitter, that could mean committing years of his life to learning the trade. If you're enjoying traveling through knitting history with me, subscribe to Stitch and Yarn Circle so you don't miss where our journey takes us next. So let's leave the wealthy customer admiring a new pair of silk stockings and walk through the other door, the workshop where those stockings were actually being made. Picture yourself as a young boy entering that room for the first time. The needles, the yarn, the finished garments may have fascinated you, but you wouldn't begin as a master. You would begin at the bottom. The exact rules varied across Europe, but the path from apprentice to journeyman and eventually master knitter shows how professional knitting skills could pass from one generation to the next. Boys could begin apprenticeships in their early teenage years through an agreement between their family and a master. Learning the trade wasn't necessarily free. Families might pay for the training while the apprentice provided labor in exchange for instruction, food, and lodging, and sometimes living in the master's household. But his first days probably weren't spent creating beautiful silk stockings. He could begin by winding yarn, preparing materials, cleaning, and completing workshop chores. Gradually, he learned to handle the needles, maintain consistent tension, increase his speed, shape stockings around the leg, heel, foot, and toe. After completing his apprenticeship, he could become a journeyman and begin earning wages. The word journeyman comes from the French journée, meaning day, reflecting payment for a day's work. Some journeymen also traveled between towns, working with different masters and encountering unfamiliar techniques. Before modern transportation or communication, these traveling craftsmen could have played an important role in carrying knitting knowledge from one European region to another. The journeyman had moved beyond his apprenticeship and was earning wages while continuing to develop his skills. However, learning from different masters was only part of his experience. Knitting was also his everyday work. So what might life look like when he arrived at the workshop and spent his day earning a living with yarn and needles? This is one part of the story where exact details are difficult to document. We don't know that every journeyman followed the same schedule, but the information about working life during that time period gives us an idea of what the long day may have looked like. Picture a young journeyman waking up around 5 in the morning and arriving at master's workshop by 6. He might spend hour after hour knitting the stockings, working near a window while daylight lasted, and continuing by candle or oil light in the evening. Imagine what those hours could have meant for his hands and his eyes. This wasn't knitting for relaxation. It was his occupation and source of income. After years of training, however, he still wasn't a master knitter. He had to pass the masterpiece test. Requirements varied, but candidates could be expected to demonstrate exceptional skill by producing fitted stockings, caps, garments, or elaborate pattern pieces. Some guild traditions included remarkably large decorative knitted works. The candidate might also purchase his own expensive materials. His completed work was then judged by experienced masters. Success could finally open the door to his own workshop. But while men followed this demanding professional path, another group was developing impressive knitting skills outside the guilds: women. This history behind our knitting needles is filled with stories most knitters never hear. Subscribe to Stitch and Yarn Circle and turn on notifications so you can continue discovering them with me. The guilds held their greatest power within cities where their rules could be enforced. Beyond those boundaries, however, knitting could follow a different path. Rural families needed additional income, and many already possessed valuable knitting skills. Merchants recognized an opportunity and began bringing yarn directly to these families, creating another way to produce knitted goods outside the guild-controlled workshops. During the 1600s and 1700s, Merchants discovered another source of skilled knitting labor in rural communities. Entire families could produce knitted goods from their homes, a practice known as cottage production, without becoming members of the formal guild system. Women and girls were an important part of this workforce, but they were not knitting alone. Boys who were not following the guild path toward becoming master knitters could work alongside their mothers, sisters, brothers, and other family members. Adult men could participate as well, especially when knitting contributed to the household income. Cottage production became part of what was known as the putting out system. Picture a merchant arriving in a rural village carrying bundles of wool and yarn. Rather than bringing knitters into the city workshop, he distributed the materials to families who transformed yarn into stockings and other goods in their homes. Family members could contribute according to their age and skill. Younger children might perform simpler tasks, while experienced knitters completed more complicated work. The merchant later collected the finished goods, paid the family, and carried the items to market. This meant one boy might follow the guild path toward becoming a master knitter, while another learned and worked entirely within his family. For centuries, guilds protected professional knitting by controlling training, maintaining standards, and limiting access to commercial markets. By the 1700s, however, cottage production and mechanical knitting were changing how knitted goods reached customers, as merchants found new ways to organize production beyond guild control. Keep watching to discover what other powerful force was approaching that would challenge the guild system. The guild system accomplished something important during its long history. It preserved valuable skills, trained generations of craftspeople, established standards for professional work, and produced knitters capable of creating extraordinary garments. At the same time, those protections could restrict competition. Becoming a master knitter might require years of training, considerable expense, and approval from established guild members. Women and others outside the guild system could face additional barriers to participating professionally. Meanwhile, the world surrounding the guilds was changing. Cottage production enabled merchants to obtain knitted goods from families working outside traditional city workshops. Mechanical knitting increased the amount that could be produced, while expanding markets created new opportunities for merchants. Political attitudes toward monopolies and inherited privileges were changing as well. Then came the French Revolution. In 1791, revolutionary legislation abolished the French guild system and its occupational monopolies. A professional system that had developed over centuries was disappearing, but knitting certainly was not. The craft had already traveled throughout Europe and survived enormous changes. Boys had learned inside guild workshops, while other boys and girls learned within their families. Journeymen may have carried techniques between regions as they traveled. Women passed knitted knowledge from one generation to another, and entire families produced knitted goods in their cottages. Eventually, machines joined human hands in producing knitted fabric. Consider the children we followed through this story. One boy might enter a master's workshop and progress from apprentice to journeyman, hoping eventually to become a master knitter. A girl might learn at home by watching experienced family members and gradually developing her own skills. Their paths were very different, yet both became accomplished knitters. Centuries later, our own knitting carries forward, techniques preserved by generations of women and men. The guilds eventually disappeared, but the craft survived and its stories continued. If you enjoyed discovering the world behind European knitting guilds, subscribe to Stitch and Yarn Circle, and join me as we continue following knitting through history, one stitch and one century at a time.